Dr. Carrier, I appreciate your time. And what are you drinking over there?
Oh, I'm drinking Glenmorangie at the present. Yeah.
So that is the blood
I finished
of the
off the
gods.
last of your wine, and so I'm now on your scotch.
Don't worry, we'll get more before you're gone. I have more Patreon questions, and I really appreciate the support from those who help MythVision do what we do, growing this empire to give education to the general public. I think it's very important that the world starts to see what's going on and understand what has happened so that we can know where we're going. So a question from our friend Margaret de Velden.
Yeah, love Margaret. Hi, Margaret. So great to hear from you again.
Absolutely. Margaret has 3. So
all right,
I'll probably take them one at a time. And let's see. Question 1 for Dr. Carrier. In a discussion, it said Paul introduces a Eucharist meal because the early original Christians did not have one. Jesus gives instructions to Paul in a vision. There was no historical Last Supper with the 12, no Judas, no betrayal. I'm not sure what night Paul means. Does he mean Seder? Paul thinks God is the betrayer? If it was Judas, then there would already be a Christian Eucharist ritual. Peter and James target Jews for conversation, but Paul targets pagans who participate in pagan meal rituals. So Paul needed one for the Christians too. Is this a valid argument?
It's very close to what's already argued by Gerd Ludemann. So Gerd Ludemann is a famous, renowned biblical scholar. He's written a lot of literature. He's an expert on Paul, by the way, so he's written a lot of literature on this. And his position is very much this, that there was no Last Supper, there was no Eucharist, that this is something probably invented by Paul. I think that's possible, but I myself don't really have a position on this. So it's entirely possible the Eucharist already existed. And when Paul says that he got it in a vision from Jesus, he's doing what he usually does, is claiming Jesus came to him and told him this stuff when really he learned about it somewhere else, right? Because he had to claim that Jesus was revealing it to him, otherwise he would be a fraud, right? So there's that problem there, is we can't really parse what's going on here. Is Paul actually inventing new tradition, or is he kind of like pretending to be a part of a tradition that already exists, essentially, right? That's unresolvable. We don't have like reliable texts from his competitors like Peter and so forth from the same time. We don't know. The other question though is, what night is he talking about, right? So what he says is that Jesus basically revealed to him that in the night that he was handed over. Now, handed over very clearly, there's several other verses in Paul where he does not mean betray. He means literally just hand over. Where it was part of the plan, right? Is the basic plan is to hand Jesus over to be executed without the person's executing him knowing that they're going to be disempowered by executing him, right? This is in Paul, 1 Corinthians 2, right? So it's all part of God's plan, and it's God, actually, Paul says, who hands Jesus over, right? So I think that's what they're referring to. So the question is, what do they mean by the night? So there must have been some sort of like mythic story being told about a specific time that this happened, right? Like particular hour of the evening or something like that. Absolutely could be a reference to the Passover Seder, for instance, because this is definitely an intentional replacement of Passover Seder. And we have that, gosh, I just did the course on the mythology of Mark for you that it'll be coming out in maybe 6 months, who knows, but
hopefully sooner.
Yeah, also hopefully sooner, but where I talk about this, that the whole replacing the Passover and making the story of Jesus about the story of Passover is a thorough theme that goes all the way through the Gospel of Mark. Mm-hmm. And Mark is very much a Pauline gospel. Like Mark knows Paul, he's using Paul's letters, might know more information from the Pauline sect than we have, right? So that's entirely plausible that this is an intentional replacement of Passover and an intentional emulation of the Lord's meals of other mystery cults, because that's Paul's other competitor, right? Is not just fellow Jews and fellow Christians, but also other mystery cults that have savior gods and salvation and so on. Personal salvation, right, is what they're offering. So any of these things are possible. And the only thing I can say is, like, is the argument plausible? Yeah, it's so plausible. It's like already been published under peer review by Gerd Ludemann. So yeah, I think so. I just don't personally think we have enough evidence to really know for sure on that.
Yeah, Bart Ehrman actually recently wrote a blog where he makes the case I don't think he is even thinking Judas at all. And it
yeah,
doesn't
right.
have anything. He says the Greek there is used elsewhere when it's talking about God doing the action.
Right, exactly. That's
so he, of course, takes time, but when he comes to a conclusion,
when
he's pretty
he does
solid.
the work. Yeah, right, exactly.
And the empty tomb legend, all that. There's so much that makes me wonder. I mean, the other hypotheses would be that that there's a tradition that Jesus died at night at some point or something.
Yeah, it could also, right, it could be, like, even if there's a historical Jesus, right, it could still be the night in which he was executed, and yet still made up, right, at the same time, right? So, like, Peter could have made it up, and then it became tradition. But it could be, like, Jesus actually was killed at a particular time, and then when Paul is having the vision, he's, of course, like, incorporating that historical information in the construction of his vision.
No way to tell.
You're right. There's no way to tell. We can't answer this. We would love to have access to way more documentation than we have to try and parse these kinds of questions. And unfortunately, as we mentioned in another one of these little vignettes, we just have to be comfortable not knowing a lot of the time. It's sad, but that's the case.
Well, Margaret has another question. She says, Paul never says Jesus will return, but only that he will come. This implies that Jesus has yet to come, even a first time. I have heard other scholars say Paul says Jesus will come again or return. It seems an important point that needs to be cleared up. Are there any passages where Paul says or implies that Jesus will come again?
Yeah, the answer is no for Paul. This is one of those things, you and I were talking about this, how there's like guild knowledge that gets passed down and people don't question it and they just keep repeating it and they don't check it and realize that it's actually false. And this is one of those things where it says, oh yeah, of course Paul says Jesus comes again. And then until you actually go and check and you find out, well, damn, he freaking doesn't. Like, that's weird. Why was I told that he was? Well, because that's kind of like the sort of the lore that exists in the guild of New Testament studies, that people just don't stop and question, like, maybe what I was told isn't actually true. Maybe I should check first. And when you check, absolutely what she says is absolutely right. That he says, even in the Eucharist example where he has the vision of Jesus telling him about the Eucharist, he says to pray until he comes. It doesn't say until he comes again. That's quite plain, right? It's quite serious that he hasn't come yet, right? He's given us visions, he's given us revelations, but he hasn't arrived, right? He hasn't physically been here yet. That is true. I think that's a decent argument from Paul. Now, there is a passage in Hebrews, and this is another thing I think might be where some of this gets confused.
Overlapped.
Right? Yeah, because there's a passage in Hebrews that could be interpreted as saying this. Hebrews is not written by Paul, right? So but some people, there was a tradition that it was, so it's easy to get this confused, like the telephone game. It's in Hebrews. All right, it's in Hebrews, not really in Paul, right? That can happen if people aren't really like specifically digging down and looking for this. But yes, there's a passage in Hebrews where it talks about him appearing a second time. But the problem is, of course, it means appearing the second time, not like coming the second time. Because he's already appeared, right? He's in a revelation. So Paul has revelations, Peter has revelations. So Jesus has appeared already, right? In any case, in the revelations. So to say that he's going to appear a second time is in reference to the first time being the revelations, and the second time would be, well, for good and all, right? So he's really going to come down physically and do stuff. The problem with it's easy to interpret Hebrews as saying it that way, but it is ambiguous, right? So there's at least that passage where you could debate about it, but the ambiguity is undeniable because it's talking about appearing rather than coming, and that's the key difference.
So let me hypothesize with you on another way of looking at this from the historicist point of view, and to see if this is a valid argument, even though there's no technically concrete way to prove it.
Yeah, right.
This is a thing me and you've talked about.
You have to. Yeah, you got to.
I think there might be a guy. You think there might not be a guy, and you have a different.
I still give it 1 in 3 odds at best, right? So
right. And so with me, I don't have a number. I wouldn't put it on, but I definitely think there was probably a guy. And if I were to hypothesize, the way I would try to understand it is, the way we approach this, if we take Jesus dies or he's born of a woman, if you take that to mean not in Galatians to be allegory of something, or like he's literally born of a woman of the seed of David, you take that approach, the standard kind of what everybody else has already jumped on, and I take that approach and that he was here but he gets killed and then he ascends, he has an apotheosis and boom, he's deified, he's son of God now in Paul's idea, and that he comes, like I don't even need it to say come again, but like that he's going to come.
So I think what you're getting at is the idea that when Paul says to pray that he comes, is that a conclusive example of saying that he didn't come before? And that the answer is no. Yeah, it's not conclusive because it has that ambiguity. But it has less ambiguity than the Hebrews passage, right?
Right.
Because it is kind of strange to say come and not come again, right? So there is something odd about that. But it's not impossible that he just forgot to add that point, or the way they talk about it is just to mention that detail. Like, that is entirely possible. And that's why, that's why I give like 1 in 3 odds or something like that, rather than like, 1 in a million.
I do think it's interesting when you're describing this, because I was reading Rendering to Caesar. John Dominic Crossan was going back to Alexander the Great and pointing out that term parousia. He wanted to get people acquainted when he's looking at the book of Revelation to say, listen, a triumphal coming of the king, this kind of thing, like where he's going to come. It's like, get ready, the king's on his way.
It's in full force. It's a glorious, and everybody's going to tremble kind of thing. Yeah.
And my point in like that term is like you're right about it being ambiguous, because it doesn't say he has come before, but it also doesn't say he hasn't, but it is one of those things, right? So it's like, is Alexander the Great coming again? Or is this the first time his gospel, by the way? That even is another thing. Like, they have gospels that they have. Right. And it's like, okay, what's going on? So I love your response to her. And like, I think it's good to practice that open-mindedness and to like approach this and be like, dude, the evidence isn't very great.
No, anyway. It's terrible. It's very frustrating. Yeah.
Yeah, especially for you when you're looking at the Greek. I'm sure you're going, oh man, because we have so much thrust with the consensus of scholarship on how to view these things that I imagine you spend a lot of time trying to defend yourself, because it's like...
Well, what happens to me is like, I get told things and believe them, and then I check them and find that, no, it doesn't hold up. And then I just point this out, like, hey, by the way, emperor has no clothes. And then that pisses off a bunch of people. And then I have to go, okay, so now I have to like go into more detail about why the emperor doesn't have clothes. And when people who are listening, they're like, okay, you're right. Yeah, the emperor doesn't have any clothes. But yeah, I do have to deal with a lot of people who won't listen to the first point, right? So they have to be told again, or they won't listen at all, right? Right. To the whole point.
Last question. Margaret, I love you. Thank you so much for the support. Does Paul think Satan and his angels, the archons of the aeons, only work in a celestial earth? Or does Paul also think, and maybe this is miswritten, but celestial earth, or does Paul also think Satan and his demons work on this earth?
Yeah, so the view, and this is demonology, right? So Jewish demonology, I have a lot of literature on that and on the historicity of Jesus when I do the section on Jewish demonology and their belief in how the world worked. Philo wrote a lot about this. The idea is, of course, that they do live in the sky. So the idea of the demons and Satan living in hell underground is a late development that actually did not exist in Paul's day. The common view at the time was that they existed in the air. They were in the sky. But yes, they could, as you see in like the Gospel of Mark, where they could come down and inhabit bodies, right, and possess people, possess animals, and things like that. And also, like, a lot of Christian writers write as though they could do things like whisper in the ear, like invisible demons could whisper in the ear of people and like tempt them or make them do things and so forth, or even physically inhabit the idols that receive the tribute and things like that. So there's this idea that they live in the air, they're invisible, at least invisible to human eyes. But yeah, they can fly down to Earth and do things, but they're doing things invisibly, right? There's not like a Perusia of Satan, essentially. Right. If there is, he's going to inhabit somebody, and it's going to be like Nero or something like that, where you have like a possessed, like the Antichrist is someone who's possessed by the spirit of Satan. Totally possible for them to believe that that's the case. So you'd have to just look for evidence of what they're talking about at the time. So yeah, it's their idea of living in the air is everything from the dirt all the way to the moon, right? Like that's the whole space that they occupy, which they knew was like 200,000 miles already, right? Which is a vast space, right? So for them, it was like this huge, scary void of stuff, of air and stuff in which things can hide and live and so on. And that's the demonology of the time. And that actually goes all the way back to Zoroastrianism, right? The Jews got this from Zoroastrianism, became a normal Jewish lore. And then the Jews used this to interpret paganism. So pagan belief in gods, they're saying, oh, you mean demons, right? And that's because the word demon is daimon, right? So that actually just means divinity. So among pagans, daimon is not a negative thing. It could be, like you can have bad daimons and good daimons. It just means a divinity, any kind of god. Typically it meant any kind of god that was subordinate to like the supreme gods, like a god that's like a multiply descended or created or whatever. Whereas supreme gods were usually called theo, right? Like they were called theos. But sub-gods, like demigods and stuff, were daimons. So in paganism, the word demon didn't necessarily mean bad. It could mean either. But to Judaism, of course, they're monotheists, or at least monolatrists. And so they hold like, oh, well, what you're calling daimons, we're going to take that as negative. Like they're only like at war with God. They're not the true gods. They're all these false gods. So these demonic entities that inhabit the world and are confusing you and corrupting you and things like that. That view gets inherited by Christianity and becomes standard, and still exists today. I am astonished that there are still major scholars who genuinely believe that there are actual demons who inhabit people, like that is actually the case.
It's kind of scary that people actually are listening. Well, I mean, I don't know if they're in the right field. It's like we need to be a little bit more scrutinizing about how people who are writing about this stuff, like if they're careful and they're being like checked by others who aren't like thinking in that magical sense, then I think it's okay. I mean, to really make sure that they know how to separate their belief from, but it's very difficult to imagine them being able to do that without some type of
influence. Yeah. I mean, they're smart enough to know to pass peer review, you can't say these things, right? So the reason I mention this is that you won't know this about most scholars because they know to clean up the way they argue things for official publications. But then you like hear them on a podcast or on a blog or something where they just start talking about like their actual beliefs, and then you're surprised, like, because you didn't see any of that in their scholarship, right? So oftentimes they do hide it, at least in their scholarship, because they know they have to for the scholarship to pass. But the question still is, like you said, like, does this still influence them? Does it create a bias that is a problem? It would have to be a bias that's not detectable by peer review. But we know that can happen. So,
and one thing on the demons, devils, archons, all of that, I know your stance, and I don't know if everybody who's watching knows, but I take like this Elaine Pagel's kind of like it could be both human and divine, as you talk about.
It's often said, yeah.
But I don't say that in every case. I'm saying Paul lives in a world full of gods.
Certainly, the word archon can mean both, right?
Right.
But the thing is like that's not how Paul writes about it. Like, so for instance, 1 Corinthians 2, he talks about the archons. He says if the archons knew that killing Jesus would end the power of death in the cosmos, they wouldn't have done it. Mm-hmm. And that infers magical knowledge of the universe, right? Like some sort of secret cosmic knowledge, not just knowledge, but belief. Like you'd have to actually believe that killing Jesus would end death, like, and so forth. And so that can't describe the Jews or the Romans, because they don't actually believe this. And even if they did believe it, like they would be like, oh yeah, well fuck, we better kill Jesus then because we want this to happen. The only entities in the world understood by Paul that would want this to be prevented, say like, we don't want the power of death and Satan and stuff to be ended, is Satan and his demons, right? So that's why the way he's writing about it, it can't be both. It doesn't make sense. But you can overlay the possibility of it, right? Like that this is the demon's attitudes, and somehow Paul is inferring or implying, even though he doesn't say it, that they're whispering in the ears they're using human agents to affect their will. He doesn't say that, but you can lay that in there. Like that is kind of an added epicycle that you could attach to the statement to get the result that you want. It's just that we don't have any evidence for that epicycle being there, which is usually the reason why. I'm very much against things we don't have evidence for.
I'm with you. That's why I'm specifically talking to the historicist in the chat here to make the point that if you're trying to make the argument that archons are always human entities, in this case where Paul only refers to them as that, I recommend, as a historicist, read Paula Fredrickson, read Elaine Pagels, get your reading on, because they admit, they clearly say.
So does David Litwa. And David Litwa says the same thing. Like he admits that the archons means demonic forces. He allows the possibility that it could mean both. Because that is in the field as a sort of a mainstream assumption. But for me, I would need evidence that that's what Paul means. But I do acknowledge that it's a possibility, but possible doesn't get you to probably. That's my problem with the methodology.
Gotcha. I really appreciate that. Margaret, I hope you enjoyed this wonderful conversation in 4K. And, I'm bragging, man. I got a heck of a camera now.
Yeah, no, it's great. It's beautiful stuff.
It really is. Join the Patreons. Go support us in the description. And thank you so much.